The spooky season is upon us, so let's spark up the campfire and get things moving. A Haunting in Oklahoma by ACAD 1288. Many years ago, my family lived at the end of a long road. It was actually the last house on the left, although that has nothing to do with the story. Previous tenants told us of odd things happening, but we didn't believe them. Our disbelief was short-lived. It began with my 4-year-old daughter screaming at something she had seen in the living room. She said it was a black cloud and that it had crossed the room and disappeared into a corner. And we dismissed it until my wife's sister visited a few days later, and she said the cloud reappeared from the same corner and enveloped her 2 little girls. Later that same day, my wife saw the cloud come from the corner and wrap itself around her. She said it was suffocating, hot, and stank of sulfur and burning meat. The cloud seemed to only manifest itself around women and girls. Unfortunately for my sons, they were not to be spared during this. The front door of the old house squeaked loudly, and no amount of WD-40, graphite, or silicone would quiet it. Now, to understand the layout of the house, you gotta understand it was built into the side of a hill. The front door faced the west, and one would enter there onto the second floor, which is where the living area, dining room, kitchen, and bathrooms all were. The bedrooms and laundry room were on the first floor, which could be accessed by the east-facing back door. One night, my boys, aged 8 and 6, heard the front door open, so they went to investigate. In the open front door, they said they could see an odd green-colored mist, but when they approached the door to see where it was coming from, the glow disappeared. My youngest boy discovered the specter's aversion to pleasant smells. My wife set out store-bought air fresheners, but this was useless. Once a room would be vacated, the fresheners would close. It was my younger son who pointed out this phenomenon, as well as the fact that scented candles would extinguish themselves once any room was left empty. My oldest was beset with his own terror. Frequently he would awaken on the bottom bunk to find a horrific and contorted face shrieking at him. He said the face was aged and wrinkled, but the gender of the entity was undefined. He also learned to put his things away, because one night he was roused by the sound of his toys moving about on the floor. He looked to see small black beings moving his trucks, his little ships and cars against the door as if to barricade it from entry. When they noticed he was watching them, they turned and began climbing the covers trying to get at him. He screamed and I came running to find him, clinging to the bottom of the bunkie board of his brother's upper bed. Up to this point, I had seen nothing, so I was still somewhat skeptical of all these stories. That changed on the last night of the haunting. We were asleep downstairs, and I was dreaming. I dreamt that I walked into our bedroom, but there was no bedroom furniture there. It was furnished as a living room, and on the sofa sat the most beautiful red-headed woman I had ever seen. Now, my wife, beautiful in her own right, is a brunette, but in this dream, I somehow knew that this redhead was my wife. She was crying. She turned and looked at me through blackened, tear-filled, and fear-filled eyes. I should have had pity in my heart for this woman, but all I felt was rage. She cowered into the arm of the sofa, and I started towards her to continue the beating I knew that she was going to get. It was when I heard a voice that I realized that the dream had been silent up to that point. In my dream, I knew that was because the wife was deaf. The voice I heard was that of my 6-year-old, and I turned and looked over to the doorway to see my real-life son standing there in clothes I had never seen before. He was wearing black pants and a long-sleeved red pullover shirt. He was soaking wet from head to toe, and his skin appeared ashen and lifeless. Again, I felt no love for my family, only a burning rage. The boy looked up to me and said, "Dad?" He too had a look of abject fear in his eyes, but he continued, "Dad? Dad? Help me!" I turned toward him and raised my clenched fist and struck the child square in the face. Suddenly I woke sitting up in bed, and my wife was sitting up as well, screaming at me, What the hell is that?" I then realized that there was a fight going on in the living room above my head. 2 men were yelling at each other, throwing around furniture and breaking glass. I jumped from my bed and ran upstairs, and as my foot fell onto the carpeted hallway of the second story, all was silent. No one was there. The windows were intact, the furniture was upright, but the door stood open, shrouded in an iridescent green glow. Drawn, I approached the door and looked out into the dark street. There was nothing. All was quiet. Fallen autumn leaves swirled in the cool night breeze, and I returned to my wife in my room to sleep. But we couldn't. We just sat in silence, awaiting the dawn. Dawn did come. As it happened, it was October 31st. I stood on my front porch drinking my coffee, trying to rationalize my dream. And then I heard it. A chill ran down my spine as I heard my 6-year-old son say, "Dad?" Scared, I turned around and looked down the hill of our house. My son said, "Dad? Dad, help me." I approached as my boy was using a stick to try to dig something out of the ground. It was a strip of black corduroy. I went to help him, but then pulled him away when I saw the flash of white bone. I grabbed my son and ran into the house. The police dug up the body of a little boy in my yard. They determined he was about 6 or so when he died, and he was wearing black corduroy pants and a long-sleeved red pullover shirt. My brother is now a detective on our local police department, and although they have a lengthy file on this boy's father, they remain unable to locate him or his beautiful, deaf, red-headed wife. It's like they just disappeared. All that was left was the buried body of their son in our yard. My aunt's place. My aunt moved into this crappy little apartment in some rent-controlled district in East LA. She'd only been there a week or so when she came home from work one day and found that the furniture had been reorganized in the living room. She was bugged out, since she didn't exactly live in a nice neighborhood. She considered it likely that someone had broken in and rifled through everything and moving the furniture in the process. Nevertheless, she cleaned up the living room and went on about her life. A few days later, she came home from work, and the furniture had all been moved again, the same position as before. At this point, she called the landlord and asked to have the locks changed because she thought that perhaps one of the neighbors had a spare key, or that the previous tenant had a grudge against the apartment complex and was taking it out on her. They came and changed the locks a couple of days later. She was feeling much better about things. Several nervous days went by. She kept coming home and expecting to see everything rearranged again, but was relieved to find that the living room remained undisturbed. After a month or so had elapsed, she came home one afternoon, and sure enough, the furniture in the living room was back in that unsettling configuration. This time she was beside herself, and she ran next door to her neighbor that she had befriended by this time. Frantically, she described her ordeal to the nice lady and begged her to come over to the apartment and look around for intruders with her. As they looked around the apartment, her neighbor became very concerned. She asked my aunt if the furniture had always moved into that exact configuration when it happened. My aunt was sure that it always did, and her neighbor went on to tell my aunt that the previous tenant, an elderly gentleman, used to keep his living room in precisely that layout. My aunt was confused because she knew that she had the locks changed and there was never any other evidence of forced entry. She asked the neighbor if she knew where the old guy had gone so that she could determine whether or not it was him that had been breaking in and moving the goddamn furniture around and generally freaking her out. Her neighbor smiled weakly and said, "Yeah, I know where he is. He died." My aunt moved out of that apartment at the end of the month. Babysitter Trouble. Submitted by Powerplant 56. This happened to me and my brother when I was about 8 and he was 6. I'm calling myself Brian and my brother Jake. It wasn't for another few years that we were allowed to stay home alone, so, like everyone else in the world, we had babysitters. For 1 year, we had this guy that lived up the street who would watch us, and he was awesome. His name was Jim, and he would let us stay up late and would crank rock records with us and tell us dirty stories and jokes right before we went to sleep. I think he was the first guy to tell us the Cheech and Chong Dave's Not Here Man skit, and Jake and I would laugh and always ask him to tell it more than once. Honestly, that still makes me laugh. He was like 17 or 18, and we thought he was the coolest guy in our neighborhood. I think he went into the military. I can't remember at this point, but he wasn't our babysitter anymore. We got this really hot girl for a little while, and she was seriously the woman I based all my teenage fantasies that I would have in just a couple of years. She was great, too. Then, when I was 9 or so, we got a girl I'll call Kathy. And Kathy was kind of nerdy and younger than our other babysitters, and we liked her, but she was also nice. I think she was more like 14, though. One night she was going to spend the night at my house as my parents had some conference out of town, and they were going to spend the night there rather than drive home really late. Kathy had a friend come over, and I don't think she was supposed to, but Jake and I didn't say anything. We were just going to watch TV and eat popcorn and stuff. This was back when all those shows were on Saturday nights, like Fantasy Island and Love Boat and that kind of thing. So anyway, this other teenager I'll call Tina comes over, and they're in the kitchen talking, and we're just watching TV. They come into the room, and Kathy asks if we want to play a game or something. It was still light out, just getting to be dark, and Jake for some reason wanted to play hide and seek, so we all went outside. My neighborhood had a lot of houses, but there was nothing behind us except fields. We had a shed and an old barn in back, but my dad didn't like us playing in the barn as it was kind of run down. So I tell Jake he has to be it first, as he wanted to play, and the rest of us would run and hide. I knew he knew the barn was off limits, and there was this little room off the back that I could hide in, and he never would look there. It was kind of like a storage shed that my dad kept tools and stuff in. I sneaked in and closed the door, which I suppose was totally unfair, and this is where things got creepy. As I'm sitting there on a stool, in comes Tina, and she has her finger up to her lips. I didn't say anything, and we were just waiting there in the dark. This is when she convinced me that we should turn this into a cops and robbers game, and that we can get Jake and Kathy if they get near this back building behind the barn. I say okay, and she says she'll pretend she's the robber and captures me, and I go along with it. I mean, I was just a kid. So she gets some rope and ties my legs together, and then ties my hands behind my back and has me sit on the floor. She went to the door and peeked outside, and then came back over to me as I heard Kathy calling out for us. This girl got down next to me and covered my mouth with her hand and says to be quiet and to wait for them. Again, I'm thinking this is just a game and go along with it. After a minute, she grabbed a roll of black tape and put a piece over my mouth and goes back to the door. Now I'm starting to think this is weird, and I start trying to talk, but obviously can't. She came back over to me and took a plastic bag and put it over my head, and then walked back to the door and went out. I mean, I'm not bullshitting. I'm a little kid tied up on the floor with a bag over my head that's making it hard to breathe. Now I'm freaking out and starting to cry and trying to breathe and get out of the ropes. Tina comes back in and takes the bag off, and she's smiling and laughing and telling me to stop crying. It's just a game. She untied me, and I'm really crying now, and she tells me she'll give me $2 if I stop and not tell anyone. I get it together and promise I won't say anything. Shit, it was $2. Right, stupid kid logic. So we leave and go back to the house where Kathy and Jake are, and they started asking where we were hiding, but I didn't say anything. Later that night, Jake says he's got to pee and goes upstairs. We were watching something on TV, and I didn't notice that Tina went up behind him. Kathy asked if I wanted popcorn, so we went into the kitchen to make it. We got back to the living room, and Tina was just sitting there watching TV, and we joined her. Again, I didn't think about Jake right away. But then I noticed he wasn't around, and I said, "Hey, where'd Jake go?" And Tina said he went to bed. I thought it was odd, but it wasn't for another half hour or so that I got up to see if he was in bed. Tina told me to stay down there and not wake him up, and I thought about earlier in the night and what had happened. I ran upstairs and into our room, and he wasn't there. I looked in our closet and under the beds and then into my parents' room, and he wasn't there either, and he wasn't in the bathroom. Then I thought I heard something in the closet, and I opened the door with Kathy right behind me. Our clothes hamper was in there with a heavy shelf on the lid, and my brother was inside the hamper. Tina had tied him up with my mom's pantyhose and put him in there, put the shelf on the lid so he couldn't get out, and just left. Jake was crying and freaking out, and Kathy did her best to calm him down, and we went back downstairs to yell at Tina, who obviously did this. But she wasn't there. She had left and went home. I told Kathy what had happened to me earlier, and she called Tina's house, but I guess no one answered. Anyway, Kathy stayed with us the rest of the night and didn't let us out of her sight. And we told my parents, and my mom had some choice words for Tina's parents, and also for Kathy for letting that girl even come around. I don't know what happened to that girl, who's now a woman, but I'll never forget that night. I suppose it's not scary to an adult or anyone listening to this, but it was creepy as a kid. I mean, what would have happened if she had stayed later and we fell asleep? I don't even want to think about that. I had nightmares about not being able to breathe for a long time after that. We don't really talk about it, but every once in a while Jake brings her up to me, and I wonder if that fucking psycho woman is out there abusing anybody else. North Omaha, submitted by Christina. Before I begin telling you my story, I have to assure you that I am not crazy. I swear the following events happened exactly as I will relay them to you. In 1990, I was expecting my first child and was in the throes of a mostly amicable divorce. My husband, who I will refer to as Marco, was from a different state and was staying until he could find his own place and move out. We rented a large house in a poor neighborhood. My mom was ill at the time and unable to work. This gets detailed, so please bear with me. We were together, 5 adults, including one sister and her husband, me and my soon-to-be ex-husband, and my mom. We had my 2 minor sisters who were teenagers, and my sister's baby, who I will call Mimi. Okay, so there was 8 of us total. We decided to pool our resources to save money. Mom and I went to check out the house to be sure it would suit our needs, and the first day the door was ajar and had obviously been broken by force. Mom wanted to leave, but I was pretty sure I was invincible, so I ignored her and walked in shouting, "Hey, who's here?" I listened and there was no answer. The house was quiet and felt completely empty. My mom followed closely on my heels and we checked out the house. The main floor had a bedroom, but the closet had a toilet in it. Strange, I thought, but I guess practical. The living room was the first room, and then the bedroom on the right as you walked from the living room, through the dining room and into the kitchen. There stood another door 20 feet away on the same wall as the bedroom, and I opened it. Behind that door was a landing with a set of stairs going up, and a separate set which doubled back the other way going down to the basement. Looking up the staircase, we could see the banister, which was cheap outdoor wrought iron you would find as a handrail, and drooping over the path of the stairs. Immediately, I guess someone had jumped from the second floor down into the stairwell, taking the banister with them. I know it sounds odd, but it is exactly what popped into my mind with a full-on visual. We walked up the stairs and I lifted the banister up so we could pass and found 3 more bedrooms and a bathroom. The house was large and would suit the family well, since the info sheet said the basement was partially finished and it came with a washer and dryer. We decided to take the house and return to the realty office to sign the papers and then told them about the break-in. They all looked at each other with knowing glances but gave us thin smiles. The day we moved in was the first night it was on TV. We watched it together and unpacked quickly during the commercials. Later, after the show, I was finishing up some small projects as I had lost all my energy and my back ached. I was 7 months pregnant. I passed the doorway to the staircases and saw the landing light had been left on through the overhead transom. I opened the door and felt along the wall and flipped the light off. My twin 14-year-old sisters began screaming from the top of the stairs, and I turned the light back on. "What the hell? Why are you screaming?" I shouted up from the landing with fists on my hips. A large figure ran from Mom's room across the hall and into the closet. They were practically speaking in unison when they answered. "You just freaked yourselves out watching it," I said, looking through my eyelashes at them. "No, sissy. It was there. It made the doors rattle." They were crying, and I relented. I trudged up the stairs with my back and legs protesting, and I flung the sliding doors open on the hallway closet. While they were cowered, hiding their faces in each other's shoulders, I looked into the closet, and it was empty, and I forced them to look inside. I repeated, "You just freaked yourselves out, chickens." They insisted I let them go first as they bolted like a stampede down to the first floor while I clucked at them. I slid the door closed and relaxed on my mom's bed directly across from the hall closet. Nothing much happened in the following month except the girls still swore they saw and heard strange things in the house. I did notice my husband, who had always slept naked with the door closed, started wearing jogging suits to bed with the door blocked open. I was sharing a bed with my mom because I didn't want to sleep with Marco, and she allowed me to do that. One night, I couldn't sleep and was reading one of my mother's romance novels to bore myself to sleep, and I needed to get up and use the bathroom. Here's a little note if you're not familiar with pregnant ladies. If you're a mother or a father, you know pregnant ladies, especially 8-month pregnant ones, sometimes must just wait in the bathroom. I was waiting when I heard it. "Hello?" The word came from just beyond the bathroom threshold, but there was no one there. My heart jumped into my throat and pounded loudly. Let me explain how it sounded. It's the same hello when you've called your friend to make sure they're home, but when you arrive after their screen door is closed. The inner door is open, yet no one answers your knock. You just step inside the door and say, "Hello?" That was exactly what that sound was. My flesh exploded in goosebumps, and all the hairs on my body stood rigidly at attention. I was filled with terror. I took a deep breath, my heart pounding slowed, and I searched for a logical explanation. I thought, it must be my brother-in-law. It didn't sound like him, but it was possible. I guess that sounded reasonable, right? "Hello?" I replied, projecting towards the open bathroom door. "Hello?" I repeated. "Is that you, Tim?" "Hello?" the voice said again, this time much closer to me than the door. I freaked completely out, and my body jerked violently. My hair is standing on end right now as I type this, and I remember that night in that house. I still get chills from it. I jumped up, arranged my clothes, and tore back down the hallway to the open door of Marco's room. I shook him awake. He half woke up and looked at me and rasped, "What's up?" I didn't know what to say, so I lied. "I'm sick," was all I said. He went back to sleep and began snoring softly. I ran into my mom's room, and it was exactly as it had been with Marco. I was out of my mind with fear. I left the lights on in the bedroom and in the hallway, and I trembled with the blanket pulled tight to my chin and just stared at the open doorway. I spent the whole night tense under those covers. When I heard Marco wake up for work at 6 a.m., I went into his room. "Why are you wearing shorts to bed and propping the door open?" I asked. "I don't know," he said, avoiding my eyes. I knew he was lying. "Don't lie to me. You're really bad at it." "I don't want to talk about it," he said. "Why?" He let out a deep breath and stared up at the ceiling before he answered. "You'll make fun of me." "I promise I won't," I said. "It's important. Please, tell me why." He sat down on the bed facing me and said, "The first night we were here, a large black shape of a man walked out of the closet around the bed and out the front window." He swallowed and looked at my face for a reaction before continuing with the story. "It happens every night. He just walks out of the closet, around the bed, and straight out the window." Marco's voice cracked slightly, and I knew it was the truth. There were more incidents in that house, but I'll tell you those later if you'd like to hear the rest of the stories. Who Was on the Phone? Submitted by Jayla. I'm 26 now, but this happened when I was 16. A little backstory. I used to visit my dad, and in his neighborhood, he knew a group of boys around my age, and I became friends with them. So they all had my number. I even started kind of seeing one of them. Let's call him C. Every time C and I would fight, he would call my number and not say anything, but after a minute I would say, "C, I know it's you," and he would start laughing and we would talk. But during this time, someone else was prank calling me, and I knew this because they wouldn't say anything at all. Even if I asked if it was C, it would be complete silence. Being the tough girl I am, I would just say "fuck you" and hang up. One night, I was up with my cousin, and I got a blocked call. C and I were fighting, so I knew it had to be him. I rolled my eyes and answered, saying, "Hi, C," but he didn't reply. So I say again, "Hi, C," and finally, after 2 minutes of silence, he finally answers, telling me he's sorry and if we can be boyfriend and girlfriend again. And I agree. After hanging up the phone with him, my cousin and I went into the kitchen for a snack, and I got another blocked call. Again, it was C telling me that he can see us through the kitchen window, and told me everything we were doing in detail. So I looked out the window, but I didn't see anyone. Still thinking it was C, this voice asked me to come outside to see him, so I asked my cousin to come with me. But when we went outside, he wouldn't show himself. When I called him, he didn't answer, so we just went back inside. Once we were inside, the phone rang again, and the voice asked why we didn't come outside. After telling him I did, he said he didn't see me. I started to get worried because C wouldn't do that. I know he would have come up to me, so I just played it off like I was tired and ended the call. The next day, I was still a little weirded out by that call, and I called C and all my other friends in the neighborhood, but none of them answered. So I went to one of their houses, and their mom told me that all the guys, including C, had gone camping for the weekend. I got so scared, and it's 10 years later, and I still don't know who my mystery caller was, and how he knew so much about me and C, and our relationship, and how whoever it was sounded like him. Let's just say I never answer blocked calls anymore. The Cornfield Incident. I've never been a believer in the supernatural, and I've always been pretty skeptical of any paranormal stories I've ever heard. I'm not sure if this story fits into this category, but I'm going to tell it anyway. When I was a senior in high school, I was over at my girlfriend's parents' house for the day. And they lived off a dirt road in a very rural area. Not too many neighbors close by, and the entire property is surrounded by cornfields, with the exception of the backyard where there were stables and horses. It was a very nice sunny day in late summer, and nothing was out of the ordinary. Both her parents were home, and I was helping my girlfriend finish up some of her weekend chores. I was finishing up the dishes while she proceeded to take the trash out to the garage. And I heard the garage door motor go off, and shortly after, she came running back inside, right over, and grabbed me. She seemed very spooked about something, and I asked her what was wrong. She said that the garage door just opened by itself while she was on the other side of the garage, putting the trash bags in the can. She then started to hear someone crying in the cornfield on the other side of the driveway. Her mother was in the room and heard this, so we all walked out into the garage. Sure enough, the garage door was open, and the sounds of what I think was a child crying was coming from somewhere in the cornfield a short distance from where we were standing. Her mother went back in the house and called for her dad, while I walked over to the edge of the cornfield to see if I could see anyone. Unfortunately, by the end of the summer, the corn is pretty dense and very difficult to see through. The crying continued, and now my girlfriend's father had come out and was standing next to me. And the crying, or more like sobbing, sounded like a little kid who had just gotten lost, but the closest neighbor was more than a half-mile away, and they were an older couple that didn't have any kids. My girlfriend's father called out, "Hello? Are you okay?" And instantly the crying stopped. And then we both started calling out, "Hello? Hello?" Nothing but silence. My girlfriend's father told me the kid must be scared and to keep calling out. He was going to go inside and call the police. I yelled out a few more times, but my calls went unanswered. Suddenly, in the direction of where the cries were coming from, there was a loud crack. Loud enough to where I actually ducked, like a large tree snapping in half, and then the sounds of smaller cracks, like someone breaking branches. Only there weren't any trees in the field. I looked back to the garage from the edge of the cornfield, and my girlfriend and her mom had that look on their face of, what the hell was that? With anxiety building up inside of me and thinking that a child might be in danger, I darted into the cornfield, calling out, "Where are you? Tell me where you are. I want to help you." Pushing my way through the corn and not being able to see more than a couple of feet in front of me, I started making my way towards the cracking sounds, which were quickly but gradually fading away. After a few more seconds, I couldn't hear anything at all. I called out again, still no response. I then dropped to the ground, hoping to be able to see further through the base of the corn stalks, and then the leaves on top. I could see much further, but there was nothing there, just more corn. I heard my girlfriend's father calling out my name, and I followed his voice back to the edge of the cornfield. As I made my way out, several police cars were starting to arrive. We told the police about the crying and that we thought a kid might be lost or hurt. So 2 officers, one being a canine unit, went into the cornfield, while 2 other police cars drove the perimeter of the cornfield. After about an hour, the officers emerged from the field and told us that they didn't find anything, not even a scent for the dog to follow. The patrolling officers said they spoke with a farmer that lives on the other side of the cornfield, miles from my girlfriend's parents' house, and he told the officers he saw 2 local boys that he lets hunt on his property come out of the cornfield early that morning. The police seemed pretty confident that this was some kind of misunderstanding at best, or a stupid prank at worst. I'm not so sure. The farmer said he saw the boys early in the morning leaving the cornfield, but we heard the crying in the late afternoon. And how did the garage open by itself? What was that cracking noise? Who was crying? And why did they stop the second we called out to them? Now for the really strange part. About 10 years after this event took place, and many years after I had forgotten completely about it, my now ex-girlfriend called me out of the blue. After a brief, "Hey, what have you been up to? How are you?" she tells me the real reason for her call. She asked me if I remembered the Cornfield Incident. and then told me that her mom is volunteering at a senior center, and one of the people she cares for is the older neighbor of theirs that lives about half a mile down the road. One day, in casual conversation about a recent farming accident that the two were reading about in the newspaper, the neighbor starts telling my ex-girlfriend's mother about an accident that happened in the early 30s. Apparently, in the very same cornfield where we heard the crying, a young boy was killed when he accidentally fell in front of some kind of farm equipment that the father was driving. The boy's father, who was a heavy drinker, didn't even notice he had just run over his son, and the boy's body wasn't found for several days. It definitely leaves me wondering, could we have been hearing the past cries of this injured young boy, hoping for someone to find him? Or was it just a coincidence? And at this point I really couldn't say, but I certainly won't be forgetting that day anytime soon. Post House. We live on an army post in Texas, Fort Hood to be exact, and I never really believed in the paranormal until we moved into this house. What follows is my true account. I don't expect you to believe it, because I never would have. We moved there around August of 1996, and the house is nice, but nothing special, a 2-story duplex. Downstairs is all tile floors, but the upstairs is the original wood the house was built with back in 1957. Everything that has happened in the house concerns the upstairs. Nothing has ever come downstairs. I know that sounds strange to say, but it's definitely how it feels. I talked to someone once, a person who was knowledgeable about the paranormal, and they thought that this might be due to the tile floors downstairs. The wooden natural floors upstairs would be more receptive to paranormal activity than the man-made asphalt tile of the lower portion of the house. That's the theory, at least. Before living here, I would have thought a statement like this was pretty nuts, really, but it feels right. The upstairs is definitely active in some way the downstairs has never been. Let me tell you some of what we have experienced here, and then I'll move on into the specifics of when I started to keep a journal of all this weirdness. The first thing was a night when we had another couple over to play cards. We were sitting at the dining room/kitchen table playing spades. I had faintly heard crying from time to time, but dismissed it as what I refer to as my mommy hearing. It's an instinctive thing. Ever since our first child was born, I have at times heard a baby crying when there was none, like an instinctive cue to check on the baby. I didn't really hear it probably, just a subconscious reminder to check on my kids. Hey, don't laugh. Lots of moms experience this. Anyway, I had been hearing it on and off, but ignoring it. We had 2 children at the time, and they were both older, ages 3.5 and 2, so if they were crying, believe me, I'd hear them a bit louder. Then, eventually, the other woman here noticed it as well, and commented that we must be picking up someone else's baby in our monitor. We did have a baby monitor sitting on top of the bookshelves. I was a bit startled. I thought it was just my imagination, but now someone else heard it as well. The guys also said they heard it, and they all agreed that it was another baby in the neighborhood. Comments were made about other people's garage door openers opening your garage door, so picking up other conversations on a cordless phone on occasion also happened. We were all joking about it. My husband said, "Honey, just turn the monitor off. We'll hear the kids if they wake up." I had gone white and was staring at the monitor when he said that. I was looking at the little red indicator light on the monitor. You know, the one that lights up when the monitor is turned on to let you know that it's working? Well, the monitor was not on. The light was not lit up. But the monitor still seemed to be broadcasting the sound of some baby crying. And again, not loudly, but still plainly coming from the monitor. When I mentioned that it wasn't on, my husband simply said, "No, the light's probably just broken, no big deal." We all agreed that that must be it. I went over to the bookshelves to turn it off, but like I said, it wasn't turned on. As I followed the cord to the wall, I noticed that even the AC adapter cord was not plugged in. Everyone commented and said it must just be on batteries. I was the only one that knew there were no batteries in the unit, so I removed the back and showed them that there were no batteries. It grew very quiet as we all contemplated what this could possibly mean. I had never come this close to the unexplainable before in my life. I mean, how could this be possible? I went upstairs to check on the girls and to check the other transmitting end of the baby monitor upstairs. We were all determined to explain this rationally, even though the transmitting end would have no effect on the impossibility of the receiving end operating while it was turned off. I mean, it didn't even have a power source. Still, we were determined to figure it out. When I got upstairs, the kids were sound asleep, and the button on the monitor was in the off position. but for some reason I needed to physically verify that by touching the switch, as if my eyes couldn't be trusted. I had to make every effort to verify that this thing was indeed turned off. Just before I touched the monitor, my hand passed into a cold spot in the air. It was like a patch of almost Arctic air that had instantly made my whole body break out in goosebumps. I ran downstairs terrified, and realized that in my panic, I had left my children upstairs in the room with, and I couldn't finish that sentence even in my mind. Everyone reassured me that the kids were fine. I mean, it was freaky, but harmless. We laughed about it a lot for the rest of the night. The monitor only did that one other time that I can recall, and it was much shorter in duration. Another thing that happens frequently is footsteps on the stairs. I'll be sitting in the living room watching TV or reading when I hear someone coming down the stairs. Judging by the sounds, it sounded to be like a small child. I mean, the steps are uncertain somehow, and they're fairly light, definitely not the steps of an adult. The first time I heard it was when my kids were upstairs asleep at nap time. I thought it was my oldest, Emily, coming down when she was supposed to be taking a nap. At first I almost just yelled up, "Emily, get in bed," or something to that effect. But instead decided to surprise her and sneak up on her. Then I put her back in bed myself, rather than just make her get back in bed on her own. I waited, crouching on the lower 2 stairs. There are 10 wooden stairs, then a landing that turns a corner, then 2 more steps to the bottom. I was waiting to scare my daughter. The footsteps stopped, so I turned the corner, but the boo I was about to give off froze in my throat. The stairs were empty. There was no one there. It would have been impossible in any length of time for a 3.5-year-old child to sneak back up the stairs silently, let alone in the 1.5 seconds it took me to turn that corner. I just froze there, unbelieving my own eyes. Then I quietly went up the stairs, only to find both girls sound asleep in their beds. Emily was never on those steps, but someone was. I mean, I distinctly heard footsteps. There was no mistaking it. I was right there. The sounds weren't muffled or unearthly sounding. It just sounded like a kid clomping down the stairs. When I was pregnant with our youngest child, I was on a lot of bed rest and an inpatient numerous times. A very rough one. At one point, my sister-in-law came to stay for a little while, just to help out. We hadn't mentioned anything about the house to anyone. I mean, we actually felt kind of silly, I guess. I've always been interested in the paranormal, but I don't think I ever took any of it too seriously. Eventually, we just started talking about this and that, and my husband Michael was at work. The kids were asleep upstairs, and we were just passing the time, getting to know each other better and talking about whatever came to mind. She was talking about something of a paranormal nature, something we were watching on television perhaps reminded her of something a friend said, and that happened to them once. That kind of vague, it happened to someone else kind of discussion thing, but really interesting. For some reason, I started to tell her about the baby monitor and the footsteps. She said, "Like that, perhaps?" as a joke. It sounded as though Emily had woken up and was coming down to see us. Anna was younger, and her footsteps would have been less steady. It was definitely Emily. We were laughing, and I almost felt silly. The whole thing seemed ridiculous, until the footsteps rounded the corner. But not my kid. We both distinctly heard the footsteps continue past the landing and onto the first of the bottom 2 steps. Then they stopped. Except, like I said, there was no one there. It was the middle of the day, bright and sunny in the living room, and although we had to turn our heads to see the stairs, we both had an unobstructed view of the stairway landing. We stared at it, not believing our eyes, for what seemed like 5 minutes, but was probably more like around 10 seconds. I turned to my sister-in-law and said, "Yeah, about like that, but it's the first time he turned the corner." We both laughed, but it was a nervous laughter. I had goosebumps all over my body. Why he? I'm not sure. I had been thinking of it as a little boy around 3 or 4 years old, judging from the weight it sounded to have on the stairs, and the level of coordination. Not perfectly coordinated like an adult would be, but much more coordinated than, say, a toddler. The gender was a mystery, but it felt right to refer to it as a he. It felt as if it was a little boy, but I can't explain why. Later that week, I was kept overnight in the hospital, and my sister-in-law was watching the kids. She later told me that while I was gone, she had put the kids down for their nap and was sitting on the couch reading, when she heard someone upstairs, walking around the kids' room and moving toys around. Concerned that Emily would wake Anna up, she tiptoed up the stairs to bring her down to play where she wouldn't disturb her sleeping sister. She got upstairs. Both girls were fast asleep in their beds. The sounds had stopped when she got about halfway up the stairs, but there was no way one of them could have fallen back asleep by the time she got up there. It was not one of the girls that had made those noises. She ran back downstairs, panicked, and stood in the middle of the living room, and then said to herself, "Oh, God, I can't leave the girls up there." So she went back up the stairs. Then she thought, well, it's kind of silly to wake them, so she sat in their room for about 30 minutes reading, and then felt better about it and went back downstairs. I'm not so sure she was terribly unhappy to be sleeping downstairs on the couch, because things don't seem to happen down there. My cousin is the one who is knowledgeable about the paranormal, and she said that the asphalt tile downstairs would be a poor conductor for spiritual energy. The man-made flooring is dead and can't absorb psychic energy, but the wood upstairs is living in a way, having come from a natural living source. When I told my cousin about the events, she immediately asked me, "Have you figured out a way to use it yet?" Now, let me just say that the very idea gives me the willies and makes me want to change the subject. I've decided that I enjoy hearing about the paranormal and watching film footage on sightings and shows like that, but experiencing it personally is a different story. I'm really a chicken, and the whole thing creeps me out. One day my daughter Emily was playing with me quietly on the living room floor, and her sisters were asleep, when she said, "Mommy, I don't like that little boy." I casually asked, "What little boy, honey?" But I had chills. Emmy said, "The one that comes in my room sometimes." I wanted to find out more, but since she's only just turned 4, I had to be very careful that I wasn't leading in any way with my questions. I wanted to know what was happening without influencing her in any way. She said, "Well, he shouldn't be in my room without his mommy. He's little like me. He should stay with his mommy and daddy or he could get hurt." I said, "Yeah, he shouldn't be by himself. Is that why you don't want him in your room?" I was hoping that was it, that nothing else happened to frighten her. "His mommy doesn't even know he's here. It's dangerous to go without your mommy." I agreed and told her that maybe she should tell him that the next time she saw him. Then I asked what he does in her room, and she said, "He just looks at me. He's not for real." "What do you mean, sweetie?" She screwed her face up in concentration and then said, "Well, I can see him, but he's not there for real. He's not pretend, though." I asked her something else, maybe to remind him that he shouldn't be there without his mom or something. I don't remember. But she had moved on and was insisting that I play Barbie some more. She was no longer interested in talking about the little boy. I've never heard of a better description of a ghost, have you? He's just watching, he's not there for real, but he's not pretend either. She's not just imagining it. He's there, but she knew that something wasn't quite right about it. I asked her about the little boy again sometime later, but she said she doesn't see him anymore. I told him I don't want him in my room. It's my room, and he's not with his mommy. He could get hurt. I don't want him in there. I asked, "Did he say anything to you? Is he going to stay away now?" She said, "No, he can't talk. He just looks sad at me, but he's not there now." She hasn't spoken of him except for those 2 instances. My husband was sleeping upstairs once when he heard footsteps start at the bottom of the stairs. He had actually just been lying in bed, not quite ready to get up, but not sleeping either. He thought the footsteps belonged to me, coming to drag him out of bed, and he lay there waiting to scare me with a pillow on top of his head as he often sleeps. The footsteps continued into the room and around to the far side of the bed. Still, he lay there, ready to scare me when I least expected it. He then felt weight on the bed, as if I had climbed onto it and was crawling over to wake him up. He told me he distinctly felt someone kneeling above him, and of course he assumed it was me. I was coming up to get him out of bed, but instead he was going to scare me half to death, and this was going to be hysterical in his mind. Just then he threw the pillow away from his face and yelled, ready to crack up when I screamed in fright. The problem was, he was alone in the room, completely and utterly alone, although he could still feel the weight on the bed and actually see the indentation where there should have been hands and knees to match. He yelled again, got up, and sprinted downstairs, where he grabbed a towel and looked at me and didn't say a word, then went back upstairs and stayed in the shower for some length of time. I went up to see what was going on, but he wouldn't tell me what happened. Later, he said he was just too freaked out to talk about it at the time, and just needed to calm down a bit before he talked to me about it. The occasional footsteps on the stairs have continued uninterrupted. Once a Ring Around the Rosie singing baby doll started singing on its own in the kids' room, and I couldn't make it stop. Although it was probably just a mechanical malfunction of some sort, it scared the hell out of me, and I threw the doll out the back door. To go into the kids' room to see who was up and playing at midnight only to be confronted by a singing doll laying undisturbed in the middle of the floor is a bit too much for me. We could still hear it after I threw it outside, so Michael retrieved it and took the mechanical insides of it out. He could be right. It could have just broken. It could have nothing to do whatsoever with this house. But when you have seen a toy break so that it turns itself on and off and then can't be turned off again, it can't happen. But it did, and it freaked me out. I half expected it to keep singing after he took it apart. And that's about all the incidents I can remember. As if that's not enough, right? Anyway, I decided to start keeping a journal of the strange goings-on at this house, to see how often things really happen here, because I know that, for instance, more happens when Michael is in the field for the Army, or now at his second job, but that I often forget to tell anyone about it. Later on, it just doesn't seem as real, or as important, or as believable. You tend to blow it off and forget about things. Now I'm curious to see how much really goes on in this house. Psychic connection. I've always believed in the supernatural, but I never had any true experiences until several months ago. I was used to having feelings of supernatural presences, but things never got strong enough to bug me until I met my boyfriend a little over a year ago. We didn't connect right away, but once we did, things started to get weird. One Friday night, there was a strong psychic connection we could feel, where we could faintly hear one another. This was a long-distance relationship, and he lived hundreds of miles away. Things got stranger when my mom and I were going to Disneyland for a 2-day trip. Because of a lower budget, we had to stay in an older motel in an unwelcoming corner of Anaheim. It was around 10 in the evening, and my mom was out cold in the bed near the bathroom. I was near the window but couldn't sleep, even though we had been walking all day. I turned off the TV and rolled over, facing where my mom slept, and tried to close my eyes. There was no use. Something was wrong about that room, and it was disturbing me. It felt unwelcoming and cold. Eventually, I opened my eyes and just stared down at the floor. But something caught my eyes. At the end of the gap between the two beds appeared to be a long, black sheet being quickly pulled along to the base of my mom's bed. I attempted to shake it off, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me, and I pulled the covers up over my shoulders. For a while, I just drifted off into my own world and ignored everything else. But once again, my mind was pulled back into reality, and my eyes shot open. I scanned the room, but settled on the wall on the other side of my mom's bed. It appeared that 2 black hands had rested on the edge of the bed, quickly followed by what looked like a head shrouded in black. It looked like it was wearing a death shroud. I froze and just stared at this thing, and it appeared as if it was staring at me, too. The feeling that flooded the room was miserable. It felt like it wanted us out of there and was willing to do anything to get us to leave. But at the same time, it looked as if it was not used to being seen by the living. I locked eyes with this thing for a moment more, and then found myself doing the unusual, burying my face beneath the blankets. I was scared beyond belief. Something about this creature was just so wrong. In a few minutes, I had blacked out. The next morning, I forgot about it. But when I got home, I started to remember, and I did as much research as I could, but I learned nothing. I still know nothing about what I saw, and if anyone knows, please respond in the comments here, even if it's just a little bit of help. I told my boyfriend about it, and he was just as creeped out as I was. Things settled down for a while, and my boyfriend joined the Coast Guard and came out to Cali to be closer to me. And then things started up again. I would do housekeeping work at a country club, and when cleaning the men's locker room early each morning, I would be the only one there. However, I would get the eerie feeling of being watched, seeing as how there were a lot of small aisles and nooks where the lockers are. One morning I was cleaning the mirrors, and something ran quickly in the reflection behind me. Frightened, I hurried through my work and got out of there. Another time I was leaning forward cleaning one of the stalls, and when I leaned back, I thought I caught a glimpse of a woman standing right next to me. But when I stepped back out of the stall, she was gone. I can still remember what she looked like. She wore a plain white floor-length dress and had fiery red hair that was pulled up sloppily. I've seen her other times, and I now believe she's a guardian spirit, and I'm no longer alarmed when I see her. Two more experiences were not visual, but audio. Walking up from the club to the maintenance department one day at noon, I heard someone hoarsely whispering my name. The only people around were sitting at a table a good distance away, and none of those people knew me. Just a few weeks later, at the same spot, I heard the same voice say, "Come here." Since then, things have been quiet. Me and my boyfriend believe that we have a strong psychic connection that gets stronger the closer we get, but we have no definite answers. I love learning about the paranormal, but still have found nothing on my most frightening experiences down in Anaheim. I really would love some answers. The Phone Bill by Turicue. About 15 years or so ago, I moved across the country for a job. When I left, it was pretty much a case of leaping for the brass ring. The dot-com crash had wiped out all the tech jobs in the area I was in, and after a year and a half of practical unemployment and crushing poverty, I gave up on ever finding a decent job where I lived. Leaping for the brass ring, or maybe leaping out of the window of a burning building, either way, it was a blind jump into the unknown. I accepted a job offer at a place in the middle of nowhere, packed what I could, and gave everything else away. Picture the scene. You're a young kid, giving up everything you know and everyone around you just for the chance at making a living. You've got maybe a couple of $100 to your name, everything you own is stacked in the back of your car, and you're driving off into the sunset. There's not much keeping you above the ground. A breakdown that takes more money than you have to get fixed, any kind of medical issue, any kind of rough wave could upset your unsteady boat, and then you're lost in the middle of nowhere with no friends to help you. The stress is almost unimaginable if you haven't gone through something like that. I made it to where the job was and found a place to live, a nasty, cheap apartment next to a liquor store and a bar that seemed to have police cars pulling in and flashing lights almost all night long. The people upstairs screamed at each other in broken English all throughout the day. Meth heads panhandled a lot whenever the cops weren't around, and the only way I could get any sleep in all of that was a combination of sleeping pills and hard liquor, the cheapest I could get. Pro tip number 1, the Colonel's Pride bourbon was like $6 for a fifth. Pro tip number 2, this is a bad idea. At some point early in the morning on one of those first days on the job, my phone rang, waking me up. You know how you are when you're bleary with broken sleep, booze, and pills? I mean, everything just seems unreal. And this was back before smartphones were big, and the cell phones you could get were expensive. I had a crappy landline with a $10 phone plugged into the wall. There was no clock on it, and I didn't know what time it was. And that it was still dark, and that no one calls at that level of darkness unless someone's dying or dead. I answered the phone still half drunk. Some part of me knew my parents had died. How could you know something like that? And the person on the phone was my parents' next-door neighbor, who must have been pushing 90. I'd cut her grass once a week when I was a kid. Adding to the unreality of the moment was that she'd been diagnosed with Alzheimer's nearly a decade before. The last time I had seen her, so little of her mind had been left that she probably wouldn't have been able to hold a telephone handset unassisted. "Johnny?" she said. "Remember how I said I mowed her lawn as a kid? I must have been the only person she ever saw for that last decade of her life that she knew. Every Saturday I'd come by with the lawnmower, watching her slow decline into mindlessness as she waved to me more and more feebly. She didn't have any family as far as anyone could tell, only an endless stream of nurses feeding her and taking care of her. I was probably the only person whose name she still remembered at the end. Looking back now, that must have been why she called me, of all people. "Hello, Mrs. So-and-so. What's wrong?" I knew the next words that were going to come out of her mouth. Car crash, house fire, some kind of tragedy. "I'm so cold," she said. I think there are... "What?" I asked. I was fighting through the pills and booze in panic and could barely hold on to the phone. "Worms," she said. "I think there are worms crawling on me." I couldn't answer. I literally didn't know what to say. But then she hung up, and the phone went to that beep, 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 beep sound you only get when you've had the phone off the hook for too long without ever dialing. Fuck, maybe I had hallucinated the whole thing. Everything was a fog and a dark haze. I hung up the phone, and I remembered hearing an ambulance siren off in the distance. I didn't call my parents right away. I didn't want to panic them with a phone call in the middle of the night over what was probably just a bad dream or a hallucination or a night terror of some kind. Instead, I spent 3 hours drifting in and out of my days, staring out the window at the lights of the bar, and watching the police cars drift in and out of the darkness like ghosts. When the sun finally came up, I knew that my parents must have been finally awake. So I called them. My mom answered the phone. I tried as hard as I could to sound as normal as possible, but she's my mom and immediately knew something was wrong. "Is Mrs. So-and-so okay?" I finally asked. "Honey, she died last Wednesday," my mom said. "We didn't want to tell you until you were settled in, but she faded out almost the day you left, and the funeral was just yesterday." In a way, it was a relief. I mean, ghosts don't make phone calls. Casper shouldn't have to rely on Ma Bell. It must have been a bad dream with coincidental timing, or more likely some deep part of my subconscious had detected Mrs. So-and-so, slowly failing and wasting away. And maybe I kept it hidden, and it only came out later like a skull being washed clean from a grave after a flood. When my phone bill came in almost a month later, I had almost forgotten the whole thing. The money actually seemed like a waste of time. I hadn't used the phone at all, other than to call my parents and to be terrorized by it that night. Also, other terrible things had swamped it out of my memory. I'd seen a guy get gunned down in the parking lot of the bar across the street, and I almost lost my job, the one thing that was making all of this worthwhile, over someone else's stupid mistake. Thank God at the last moment the truth came out and I was spared. I mean, the horrors of the real world had completely washed out the terrors of that night. I remember sitting at the cheap peeling formica table in the corner of my apartment that was my combination desk and kitchen table. I was just staring at the bill. $48 for a telephone that I had only used twice to call my parents, and that no one had ever even called me. But the bill said otherwise. One incoming call was listed. Without even thinking, I threw the bill away without looking at the number. I didn't want to know. "I think there are worms crawling on me," she had said. I canceled the phone the next day and bought a cell phone I couldn't afford. I'm sure it was nothing, maybe a wrong number, maybe a telemarketer, who knows. All I know is we can choose what we want to believe, and I choose to believe that that call in the night was nothing more than just a nightmare. It's easier that way. Thanks for listening, gang. Hope you liked what you heard, and if you care to, leave me a tip at Patreon for as little as $1 per month. You can help keep this channel alive. Please like, share, and subscribe, and follow me on social media. All the links for that are in the description below. Be sure to check out my paranormal radio show every Sunday night. It airs live at 8 Eastern, theedgeoftheunknown.com, or find me on iTunes or TuneIn Radio. Don't forget to send me your scary Halloween tales, and of course, send any stories to unclejoshtruescarystories@gmail.com. I'll see you in the next volume, and remember, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.